Hi, in this video, let's create this minimal to-do application in which you can see your to-dos, add to-dos, edit them, and also delete them. Here are all the things that we are going to be using in this video. Next.js 14 with app router, Mongodb as database, Shadcn UI for components, Prisma for database related operations, SWR for data fetching, and XORD for form data validation. Prisma, if you do not know, is a toolkit that lets you communicate with your database very easily. And one of the reasons why we are using Prisma is because it provides strong type safety. Type safety is a concept in programming that ensures variables are used in a manner consistent with their data types. For example, in JavaScript, you can create a variable called username, initialize this variable with a data of type string, and then later in the code, you can update this to any other data type. For example, number here. But if you try to do something like this in TypeScript, it is going to throw you an error at the development time only. So essentially, you could say that type safety can make your code more robust. SWR is stale while revalidate, and it is actually a hook that is created by the team behind Next.js, and we can use this for a client-side data fetching. We are also going to be using XORD. So XORD is a schema declaration and validation library. Through XORD, it becomes very easy to validate the data, both on the client side and server side. Now, before we go ahead, I want to clarify one thing. Whenever you want to build an application like this, you can build this application in two ways. First is more like the traditional React approach in which the data fetching happens on the client side. And then you also have this another approach in which the data fetching happens on the server side. A page gets created and then that final page gets sent to the client. So essentially client-side data fetching and server-side data fetching. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be focusing on client-side data fetching. If you want a video on a different approach, such as server-side data fetching, just put a comment, I'll create one. All right, let's create a new Next.js project. I'm going to be using pnpm as a package manager. If you're using npm, I will tell you all of the alternative commands so you can follow along. So in order to create a Next.js 14 project, I'm going to execute this command pnpm dlx, create next app, and then I'm going to specify the name of the project. So let's call this Next.js Todo. If you are using npm as a package manager, make sure you do npx in place of pnpm dlx like this. I will choose all of the default options, and then I'm going to open this folder in my code editor. Let's first remove some of the things that we do not need. Inside of this app directory, I'll go to globals.css, and except these three lines, I'm going to remove everything else that is present in this file. Then I'll go to page.tsx that is present directly at the app directory, which is actually our home page. And I'll replace this entire content with some simple content. So right now our home page just contains this heading which says to-dos, and you can see the application over here. Okay, let's now install our dependencies now. First we need to install SWR and XORD. So I'll do pnpm add SWR and XORD. If you're using npm, do npm install. Then we need to install Shadcn and set up it also. So I'll do pnpm dlx Shadcn latest and then init. If you're using npm, do npx Shadcn latest init. And I will choose all of the default options. Finally, we need to install and set up Prisma. So for that, I'm going to be running this command pnpm dlx Prisma init. And since we are going to be using MongoDB as a database, so we also need to provide this flag data source provider and set its value to MongoDB. Now after running that command, there should be a folder at the root of your project called Prisma, and it should contain a file called schema.prisma. In this file, we will create our models and define the structure of our database. For the purpose of this video, we just need this one model called Todo, and this is going to contain a few fields. ID, title, description is completed. Now here I'm specifying that ID is going to be of type string. It is automatically going to be generated. And since in MongoDB, it uses underscore ID in place of ID, we are mapping underscore ID with this ID field so that whenever we get the to-do, we should be able to access its ID by doing something like this instead of doing something like this. So that is why we are mapping it. And finally, we have this title, which is going to be a string. Description is also going to be a string, and is completed is going to be a Boolean value. and the default value is false for this. Now at the root of the project, there should be a file called .env. This file was automatically created when we ran that Prisma command. So let's first make sure that we ignore this file in the git ignore. So I'll go to git ignore and include .env over here. And then I'll go to .env. Now this expects you to have this environment variable database underscore URL. And in this database URL, you are going to pass a connection string. And through this connection string, you will be able to connect to your database. In my case, I'm going to be using MongoDB Atlas to get the database. You can also use it. It is absolutely free. So you simply need to go to mongodb.com products platform Atlas database, and then you need to sign into your account. You can simply sign up with your Google or GitHub or using your email address. I'll click on Google. I'll choose my account. Now, if this is the first time that you have created your account, it is going to ask you to create a new project. I've already created this project, as you can see over here, called YouTube. And then inside of this project, you simply need to create a cluster. I have already done that. But what you really need to do is click on this create new. This is going to show you an interface from which you can select the type of cluster you want and then choose its location also. I'm not seeing the free option here because I already have created a free cluster. As you can see over here, cluster 0. Now I simply need to click on this connect, go to drivers, and this is going to give me the connection string. I will copy this to my code editor and paste this connection string over here. Now, if you take a look at this connection string, you'll notice that we have this username and then we have this password. We need to enter this password. So I'll enter my password. And then after this / mongodb.net, I can specify the name of the database I want to use for this particular project. So I can simply say Next.js Todo. Now this is automatically going to create this database whenever we push the changes to the database. Now two important things here. First of all, if you go to your MongoDB Atlas, you can go to database access. And if you do not see a user over here, you can simply create a database user, set their password. Or if you forgot your existing password, you can simply go to the current user by clicking on this edit button and then change your password from here. And then use that password in the connection string. Another thing is in the network access tab, make sure your IP address is listed over here. What this means is that this IP address is allowed to make connection request to the database. And right now I have set up this to allow connections from everywhere. Obviously, you do not want to do this when you will be pushing this to production. So in the production, you can replace this IP address with your server IP address. All right. So now we got the connection string also. Next, we need to set up the Prisma instance. So inside of the lib folder, I'm going to create a file called prisma.ts. In this file, we first need to import the Prisma client from Prisma client. And then we are declaring that the global object contains this Prisma global variable so that TypeScript does not complain. And we're first checking if the global object contains the Prisma global instance. We are getting that instance. Otherwise, we are creating a new instance by calling this Prisma client singleton function. As you can see, this is just returning a new Prisma client and nothing else. And then we are just exporting the Prisma instance from this file. And finally, in the end, you need this line so that during development, we do not make a lot of unnecessary connections to our database. Now, if you notice carefully, that TypeScript is giving you this error, cannot find module Prisma client or its corresponding type declaration. And it's because the Prisma client has not been generated yet. So the thing is, whenever you update your schema.prisma file, like we did, we added this model Todo. We need to push these changes to the database. And the way you push the changes to the database is by running this command pnpm tlx prisma db push. If you're using npm, do npx prisma db push. When I run this command, what this is going to do, this is going to push the changes to the database. And then it is also going to generate the Prisma client, right? So now if I just come to the prisma.ts file, you can see that we are not getting any error. Perfect. Now our Prisma setup is ready. Let's now start creating the user interface for our application. For that, I'm going to be needing a few components, Shadcn components essentially. The first thing that I'm going to need is a button. So I will simply install the button component by running this command pnpm tlx shadcn latest add, and then I can specify the name of the component that I want to install. So I can say button. Button has been installed. I will start the development server, go to my home page. In this home page, I'm going to import the button component, and then I'll use this button component over here that says this text add to do. If we take a look at our page right now, this is what we are getting right now. Okay, perfect. Now we need a to-do list component that is going to render to-do list over here. So for that, I'll go to the components folder, and in this components folder, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call this to-do list.tsx. And here's what I'm doing in this file. First of all, I'm making this a client component. And the reason why I'm making this a client component, because I'm going to need some sort of interactivity with these cards in the future. Now, if you do not know, in Next.js, you have two kinds of components, client components and server components. And depending upon your use case, you can use any of them. There's both pros and cons to each of these. But since we need to provide some sort of interactivity, and also we are using hooks like useState, we need to use this use client directive at the top of the file to make this a client component. And then we are importing the CRUD component from Shadcn, useState from React, and then I'm getting the to-do type from the Prisma client. So if you're using Prisma, so if you take a look at the schema.prisma file, this is the model that we have created. And the benefit of doing something like this is Prisma automatically gives you the types that you can use directly with your TypeScript. So I can simply import to-do, and then I can specify over here that this to-dos is going to be an array, which is going to contain a bunch of objects, and each objects are going to be of type to-do only. And if I hover over this, you can see all of the properties and methods related with this. And then here we have just this one div. I'm just checking if we do not have any to-dos, we simply render this card that says all done for today. And if we have the to-dos, we're simply looping through those to-dos and rendering those cards over here. Now we're getting this error related to the card component because we have not installed the card component yet. So let's do that also. I will install the card component. In some cases, if you're still getting the error, what you can do is you can simply restart the TypeScript server. You need to press Command Shift P, and then you need to write restart TS server. This is going to restart the TypeScript server, and you will get rid of unnecessary TypeScript related issues. That is actually not a problem. And if you do not want to do that, you can also restart your VS Code or code editor. So let's use this to-do list component inside of the home page. So I'll go to page.tsx, and then below this div, I'm going to import that to-do list component, to-do list. And if we take a look at the page right here, you can see that we are seeing this UI all done for today because we do not have any to-do as of yet. Now the next step is to set up SWR so that we can fetch to-dos directly from the database. So in the to-do list component, we can import use SWR from SWR, and then I need to create a fetcher function. The reason why we need this fetcher function is because SWR gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of how you want to fetch the data. For example, you can fetch your data either with Axios or any other library or just native fetch, and then give that data to SWR to manage it properly. So that is why we need a fetcher function. Then we can get rid of this to-dos and set to-dos because we do not need it like this. We simply need to call use SWR, and with this we are specifying that this is going to be returning an array of to-dos. And whenever you're calling this used SWR, this is going to accept two arguments. First argument is about from where I should fetch the data. So we want to fetch the data from this route API to-dos, which we are going to be creating in a bit. And in the second argument, we need to provide the fetcher function that we have created. When you do this, this is going to return a few things. This is going to return you the data, which we can call to-dos. And then this is also going to return you error and is loading. And based on this error and is loading, I can return a different UI from this component, for example, like this. So as you can see, I'm just checking that if we are loading, We're simply returning this loader out of this function. Otherwise, we are checking if we have an error. If we have an error, we are returning this error failed to load to-dos. And then if we are here, that means we are not loading and we do not have any errors also. So we are just getting the to-dos. And if for some reason to-dos does not exist, we are setting this to an empty array. And then we can use this to-do list in place of to-dos over here like this. And we can also get rid of this use state because we do not need that. Okay, so at this point, we are trying to fetch our to-dos from this route API to-dos, but we have not created this API route yet. So let's create this route handler, which is going to return the to-dos. Inside of this app folder, I'm going to create a new folder called API. Inside of this API folder, let's create another folder called to-dos. And then this to-dos will contain a file called route.ts. First, we are going to import Prisma and Next response. And then I'm going to set up a get handler, which basically means whenever I get a get request to this particular route API to-dos, just execute this function. So here's what I'm actually doing inside of this function. I'm using Prisma to find all the to-dos present in the database, and then I'm returning that to-dos as a JSON response. If there is any error, I'm simply returning this generic error message, an unexpected error occurred with a status code of 500. We are again getting this unnecessary error. So let me restart the TypeScript server again. And as you can see, it has been fixed. All right, so at this point, our backend route is set up and we are actually making a request to the backend to fetch all the to-dos. When we are fetching the to-dos, we are showing this loading screen. If there is any error, we are showing this fail to load to-dos error. And then if we get the to-dos, we are simply rendering those to-dos over here. So let's see if this is actually working or not. So if I just come here and refresh the page, you can see that for some time you see that loader over here. And then after that, we see all done for today because we do not have any to-dos yet. So how about we simply add some to-dos to the database manually? And one of the ways we can do something like this is by using Prisma Studio. So I can simply run this command pnpm-dlx Prisma Studio. Again, if you're using npm do npx Prisma Studio, this is going to open a user interface for you, which will show you all the models that you have created. So I can simply click on this to-do model, and then you can see that we do not have any to-dos yet. So what I can do, I can click on this add record, and in the title, I can simply fill this as the first to-do, right? And then I need to click on this save one change button. I can click this. This is going to insert that to-do in the database. So now when I just go to the page, you can see that our to-do is already appearing over here. And have you noticed we did not even have to refresh the page itself? The reason for that is because we're using SWR. It automatically fetches the data whenever your tab or window gets focused. So that's also a really good thing. Of course, you can disable this behavior if you want, but I like this. Let me make this a little bit slower so that we can clearly see if this is actually working or not as expected. So I'll come here and I'll choose this to fast 3Z, and then I'll refresh this page. As you can see, the loader is appearing, and then after that, our to-do appears. Perfect. So that means we are now able to fetch the to-dos from the database. Let's now implement the create to-do functionality. And the plan is whenever someone clicks on this add to-do button, a dialog should appear through which user can create their to-dos. So for this, we're going to be needing a few extra components from Shadcn. I'm going to install all those components by running this command shadcn latest add, and then I can specify all of the components that I need. For example, I need a dialog. I also need this form component. I need this input. I need text area. And then I also need this checkbox. All right, this is going to install all of the components. So this is asking me the button already exists. Would you like to override? That's fine. I'll say yes. Okay, so now all the components has been installed. Now what I'm gonna be doing is I will simply go to the components folder, and inside of this folder, I will create a new component called create to do. This is also going to be a client component. I'm importing button and dialog from Shadcn, and then I'm just returning this dialog. Now, the important thing to notice in this dialog component is this dialog trigger. As you can see in the dialog trigger, I have added this button called add to do, and I have added this as child prop. What this will allow me to do is that whenever someone clicks on this add to do button, it is going to trigger the opening of this dialog. Let me show you. So we need to go to page.tsx, and in place of this button, we are going to replace this with create to do button. Well, create to do component actually. Let me import this. And now if I just come here, refresh the page, you'll see exactly the same thing that you saw before. But now when I click on this add to do button, you can see a model appears, a dialog appears, you could say. And then I can click on this close button to close this dialog. And I can also click on anywhere over here to close this dialog. All right. So now this model is appearing, which is perfect. Let's now create the to-do form now. So inside of this create to-do component, I'll come here. And first I'm going to import a few form related components, form and input. Then inside of this dialog content, below this dialog header, I'm going to add this form component. Now here's what I'm doing with this. So this form component has this form HTML element, which contains a form field. The name is title. This form field has this render prop, which basically returns a form item. And this form item then contains this form control, which contains your input. And then we have this form message, which can be used to show error messages or any kind of message related to this particular input field. The next thing that we need to do is we need to set up a form instance. And for that, I'm going to import a few things like Zod resolver and use form from React Hook form. And then I'm going to call this use form. Now here's what I'm doing over here. I'm calling this use form, and this use form expects an object passed to this. This object contains two important properties, a resolver and default values. Default values is self-explanatory. The title is set to empty string, description is also set to empty string, and is completed is set to false. And with the resolver, Zod resolver, I'm specifying that for the data validation, I want to use Zod. This Zod resolver expects this to-do schema that we'll be creating in a bit. And with this to-do schema, we are specifying that the object that this returns is going to be of type to-do schema. Now the difference between this to-do schema and this to-do schema is that this is the type of to-do schema and this is the actual to-do schema, right? So now we get the form instance. We need to spread out this form instance and pass everything as prop to the form component. And for each of the form field, we need to add a control prop and set its value to form.control. Okay, let's set up our to-do schema now. So in the to-do schema, we are going to set up the structure of our to-do and also set validation rules for them. So in the lib folder, I'm going to create a new file called zod.ts. Here's what I'm doing in this file. I'm importing Z from Zod. I'm creating a new to-do schema, which is going to be an object that contains three properties. Title, description is completed. Title is going to be string, should have a minimum of 1 characters. If it does not have 1 characters, we are going to show title is required. If it has more than 100 characters, we are going to show them title must be 100 characters or less. And similarly, you can understand these. Dot optional makes any of these optional. So we are exporting this to-do schema, and we are also exporting the type of to-do schema. So Z object has this infer method that you can use to get the type of any schema that you have created in the Zod. So that is what we are doing over here. And then we are exporting the type out of this file. Now in the create to-do, I can simply import these from that Zod file. Now similar to this input field that is going to represent the title for the to-do, I'm going to add another form field over here for the description. And this is exactly like the previous field. It just contains the text area in place of input. So let's also import this text area. All right. And finally, we should also add this form field, which will allow user to complete their task. So pretty much all of these three fields are the same. It's just that they have different components internally. For example, the first input field that has this title has this input type of field. Then in the description field, we have this text area. And then in the is completed field, we have this checkbox. So let me import this checkbox also. This checkbox has this checked prop, and we are setting this its value to field.value, and then on check change, and its value set to field.change. We just need to do this, and then everything is going to be set up for us automatically. And finally, we also need a button to submit this form. So if we just take a look at the form right now, you can see that this is the form, contains title, description, and also this mark as completed field. Perfect. So in terms of UI, pretty much everything is done here. We just need to set up what happens when we submit this form. So I'm going to add this on submit prop and set its value to form.handle_submit on submit. And then we need to create an on submit. For the time being, just do this on submit. This is just going to log the data that we get from the form. So at this time, I think we should be able to see if the validations and everything else is working with our form correctly or not. So let's see. I'll click on this add to do. First of all, if I click on this create to do, this is going to tell me that title is required. And only if I enter something over here, I am allowed to submit to that form. Let me show you. If I just go to inspect, go to console, you'll see this object and you'll see all of the values. Description is completed and title. Perfect. Let's now actually send this data to the backend and store this to do in the database. First, I'm going to create these two state variables is submitting an error message. I'm going to import use state from React. Here's what I'm doing on this on submit. First, whenever we are submitting this form, I'm setting this is submitting to true. And then I have created this try catch and finally block over here. Inside of this try block, I'm trying to make a fetch request to this API route, API to do's. The method is post, and I'm sending the to do data over here in the body. If the response is not okay from the backend, I'm throwing this error that we got from the backend, or this generic error failed to create to do. And then I'm resetting this form if we are here. In the catch block, I'm basically catching those errors, and I'm checking if the error is an instance of error, get the error message, otherwise show this generic error and unexpected error occurred. And then I'm setting the error message over here. And finally, I'm setting the set is submitting to false. So above this form component, I can actually render that error message also. I can say if the error message exists, show the user this error message. And also it's a good idea when this form is being submitted, we should disable this button so that it does not fire the on submit handler multiple times. So you could simply do this disabled it's submitting, but I'm gonna do a little bit more advanced than this. I will replace this button with my button. And here's what I'm doing in this button. First of all, whenever we are submitting this form, we are disabling this button. And then I have added some of the stylistic changes. For example, if you are submitting the form, this is going to show you this loader. And then we have this create text. Now we just need to set up the route handler. So I'll go to API to do's route.ts. And similar to this get method, I'm going to create a post method over here. And here's what I'm doing in this post method. First of all, I'm getting the body from the request. And then I'm actually validating this data in the backend because it is always a good practice. So in the form, we are validating the data in the front end, but it is always a good practice that you do this in the backend also. So we just need to import this to-do schema from Zod. And then we are using this safe parse method and passing the body to this. This is going to give us, based on our validation rules, that if this data is valid or not. So if the data is not valid, we are simply returning this JSON response that invalid input. Then we are getting the to-do data if we are over here. And we are creating this new to-do over here, prisma.todo.create, and we're passing the data like this. And since this description field can be optional, so let's also pass this empty string whenever the description is not available. After creating the to-do, we are simply returning this new to-do with a status code of 201. This is not required, you will understand in a bit, but I'm just doing this. And then for any errors, we are simply returning this generic error message to the user with a status code of 500. Let's also import this next request from next server. So just by doing this, the create to do functionality should be working. Let's test this out. So right now we only have this one to do over here. If I just come here and write another to do, click on this create button, it looks like nothing happened. But if I just come here and refresh the page, you see that it actually worked. So that means at this point, the to do is being created. However, the user experience a little bit odd. So let's improve the user experience a bit. So what should happen is after to-do creation, this dialog should close automatically, and then to-do should appear over here also automatically. And we should also reset any error messages if we have any. So in the create to-do component, I will come and first I will import the mutate function from SWR. I'm also going to set up a variable that will allow me to control the opening and closing of the dialog conditionally. And then in this onSubmit callback, after we get the successful response like over here, we need to set the dialog open to false, mutate and pass this route API to do's. So what this tells SWR is that I want you to clear this cache and revalidate this cache. That means this cache is no longer valid. Refetch the latest data. So this is going to make another request and get the fresh latest data. And we'll see that latest data automatically in the page itself. And let's also set the error message to an empty string. And then in the dialog, we need to hook this open and on open change with the variables that we have created. So let's see if this is working or not. I'll come here. I'll click on this add to do. I'll say third to do, some description over here, and then I'll click on this create button. You saw that it automatically closed the model. The to do appears over here and it looks like everything is working as expected. Perfect. Let me show you this on a slower network. So I'll come here, go to network tab, and then fast 4G is fine. I'll come here and I'll do another to do goes here. I'll hit enter. This is going to create that to do, fetch the latest data, show it over here. Perfect. So now at this point, we are able to create our to dos also. Let's add two buttons to each of these cards that will allow us to delete these to dos and update these to dos also. So in the to do list component, I will go to this card component. And in this card, I'm going to give this a class of group and relative. I'm giving this group class because I want those buttons to appear whenever I am hovering over these cards. I do not want those buttons to appear always. And then relative class because those buttons is going to take a reference from this parent and they'll sit on top right corner. Let's start with delete button. So above this card header, I'm simply going to add this button, add this div, which has this absolute positioning with a top and right value of 2. And initially its opacity is 0. But when the group is hovered, its opacity is set to 100. And we also need this button component. So let's import that. And we need this trash icon also. All right. So if I just come here, then you can see that we are actually seeing this delete icon in all of our to-dos. Perfect. So let's actually implement this delete to-do functionality first. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to create a different component altogether for this. So inside of this components folder, I'm going to create this component called delete to do. And this is going to be a very simple component. It is going to be a client component. We are importing button, icon, and then mutate from SWR. And then we have this button over here. Whenever we click on this button, we call this handle delete function. And in the handle delete function, we are actually making a delete request to this particular route API to do's. And we're passing the ID of the to do as a query parameter. If the response is okay, that means the to do has been deleted. And we're simply going to revalidate this path so that SWR can fetch the latest data from the database. Otherwise, we're simply logging this error field to delete to do. You can give some sort of feedback to the user if you want over here also. Now in the to-do list component, in place of this button, I'm going to use that delete to do component. Delete to do and we're going to pass ID like this. Let's also get rid of this button and trash icon. So now in the delete to do, we are actually making a delete request to this API to do's, right? But if we take a look at our route handler API to do's, it is not set to receive that delete request. So let's implement that also. I'm going to set up this delete method. Whenever we receive a request, delete request over here, we're simply getting the ID from the search parameters. If the ID does not exist, we are returning this JSON response that ID is required with a status code of 400. And then we are deleting this to do. And if this is not a success, we are returning to do not found. Otherwise, we're returning to do deleted successfully with a status code of 200. And in case of any error, we're simply returning this generic message with a status code of 500. So with this, we should be able to delete our to-dos. I'll simply come here, refresh the page. I'll click on any of this, and you can see that I'm able to delete any of my to-dos like this. Let me create some. First to-do, second to-do, and I'm able to delete any of these. Perfect. So now the delete functionality is also working. So the only thing that is left now is to give the user this ability to update their to-dos. And if you really think about this, that updating the to-do and creating the to-do almost always going to have the same kind of code. That means at this point, we need to do some sort of a refactoring so that we can prevent ourselves from writing a lot of duplicated code. So in the create to-do component, I'll come and I'm going to refactor this into smaller pieces so that we can use some of the parts in a reusable manner. I'm going to be dividing this create to-do component into 3 parts: to-do form, create to-do, and then update to-do. So first, I'm going to create a to-do form component inside of this components folder. And this to-do form just contains the logic related to the form specifically. Let me show you what I'm doing here. So first of all, this is a client component. We're importing these use form and sort resolver because we are going to be creating a form instance. Then we are importing a bunch of Shadcn components, which we already did in the create to-do component. And then we are importing the to-do schema, type to-do schema. We have created a new interface, to-do form props. Now this to-do form component expects a few things: default values, which is going to be different for create to-do form and update to-do form. And then on submit, like what should happen when the form gets submitted. And then submit button text, what should be written in the submit button text. And then is submitting, which is going to be a Boolean. So here we are simply creating a new form instance. We are passing the default values that we got from here. And then the rest of the stuff remains exactly same as you can see over here. And then in the create to-do component, I'll simply come here and get rid of the entire code related to the form. In place of this, I'm going to be using to-do form component that we have created just now. So I'll simply replace that. So I'm passing default values. Title empty, description empty, is completed false, and then on submit, submit button text, and is submitting. So pretty much all of the stuff that we were doing before, it's just that we have moved the form functionality to a different component and nothing else. We can get rid of these unused import statements now. Before we go ahead, let's actually test if the create to-do is still working or not. So I'll refresh the page once. I'll come here. I'll say another to-do, this whatever, and then I'll click on this create, and you can see that this is working as expected. Now let's create another component called update to-do. So inside of this components folder, let me create this new file called update to-do.tsx. This is exactly going to be like create to-do. So here's what I'm doing here. This is also going to be a client component. I'm importing use state and mutate from SWR. Then I'm importing a few components. I'm importing the to-do form. I'm importing the types and then some icons. So in this update to-do, we have this is submitting error messages dialog open. So we have this on submit handler like we had for create to-do, and similarly, the rest of the stuff remains exactly like same. So this contains the dialog, and in the dialog, we have this button that has this pencil icon. Now, the only important thing to notice about this update to-do component is this on submit callback. So in this, we are actually making a put request to this API to-dos, And then we are sending this data, to-do data, along with the ID of the to-do that we need to update. And if the response is not okay, we are throwing this error. If the response is okay, that means we are here and we are setting the error message to empty, closing the dialog, revalidating the cache. And depending upon if we have the error or not, we are setting the error message, and finally we are setting it submitting to false. So the only thing that changes is the type of request that we are making to the backend and the data that we are sending to the backend. And I'm pretty sure there is a better way to organize all of this code, but I want to keep this simple and not to have a lot of moving pieces so that you can understand this in an easy to understand manner. Now the last thing that we need to do is we need to set up the put method in the route handler. So I'll go to API to-dos, and here's what I'm doing here. So whenever I receive a put request, I simply get the ID and rest of the things. And the reason I'm creating these two separate variables for this because if I pass the entire body to the to-do schema, this is going to strip out the ID and I won't be able to get the ID later. So that is why I'm getting the ID separately. Then rest of the things I'm passing to the to-do schema to validate if this is actual valid data or not. If this is not valid data, send them this error. Otherwise, get the to-do data as to-do. So let's import this from Prisma client. Okay. And then if the ID does not exist, we'll say that to-do ID is required. We are updating this to-do over here. And then if this is not successful, we are saying to-do not found. And then if this is successful, we are returning this to-do along with a status code of 200. And similarly, in case of error, we are returning this generic error with a status code of 500. So now we just need to go to to-do list component. And in this card, we also need to add this update to-do component like this. And this expects the entire to-do. So let's pass that to-do over here. And now let's see if this is actually working or not. So I'll come here, refresh this one. I'll click on this. I'll say updating this to-do. This to-do has been updated. And I'll click on this update. Okay, so as you can see, this has been updated. Let's click on this, mark this complete, update. As you can see, this has been completed. Similarly, I can click on this, mark as completed, and this has been also completed. So perfect. So now everything is working. Create is working, update is working, delete is working, and we are able to read and render all of these to-dos over here. So this was about CRUD. That's all for this video. If you found this video valuable, do like and subscribe to my channel, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.